Welcome to Family Health by Mini First Aid. Mini First Aid are the UK's leading family first aid provider, and we are delighted to bring our latest podcast series to you, giving you all the information that you need around family health subjects. Thanks for joining. The Family Health Podcast is brought to you in partnership with Things Happen, a trusted financial advisor that supports new parents and their families. Things Happen offer the best advice to help parents and their families make informed financial decisions, ensuring a secure and tax-efficient future for their children. The team at Things Happen are highly qualified financial experts who will guide you through the different types of policies to consider as your family expands, taking the stress out of decision-making by finding the best deals for your needs, ensuring you and your family are protected no matter how busy life gets. If you already have life insurance, Things Happen will carefully review your existing policy to ensure that it still meets your family's evolving needs, so you know your family is fully protected. Hello, I'm Kate Ball and I'm the founder of Mini First Aid, and welcome to our podcast, Family Health by Mini First Aid. As always, I'm delighted that you've taken the time to listen to our podcast, because whether you're in the car, you're cleaning the house, or perhaps you're relaxing with that rare cup of tea, our Family Health podcast covers a huge range of topics that might affect one of your family members. And if you've ever got a family health concern and you think, oh, I'll just Google that, please don't. Please listen to us instead. Now, our guest this week is the wonderful Dr. Lillie Parker. Lillie is an NHS pediatrician and has over a decade of experience caring for children and young people. Lillie's going to talk to us today about the dreaded chickenpox, but also touch on other childhood rashes that could be confused with chickenpox. So it's lovely. As always, it's lovely to have you with us on the Family Health Podcast. Lillie, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be here.
Lillie, I know it's peak chickenpox season just around the corner, and so this conversation is very timely, and I'm absolutely delighted, as always, that you're here. But before you get started, tell our listeners a little bit about yourself.
So, as you said, thank you, Kate. I am an NHS paediatrician. I have been working in the NHS for around 10 years, and I currently work as a paediatric emergency doctor, so in a A&E department dedicated to children. I see kids from newborn babies all the way up to 18-year-olds, so it's a very wide spectrum. I see everything: illness, injury, mental health, social stuff, everything. But a large amount of what we do is younger children with variety of infections, including chickenpox. So I'm really happy to be here to talk about that. I think the last episode we did, I talked a little bit more about my background and why I became a paediatrician. So I won't blow on too much, but yeah, I'm super happy to be back talking about this.
Brilliant. And you can go back and listen to the bronchiolitis episode where we talk about respiratory viruses. It's a great episode. So please drop back and listen to that and hear more from Lillie. Now, I want to talk to you about chickenpox. And obviously, I'm going to ask the silly question, but, you know, people might want to know, what's it got to do with chickens? Why is it called chickenpox? Where did the name come from?
I love that you asked this question. So I knew you were going to ask this question. Thank goodness I knew, because honestly, I wouldn't have known what to say.
We warned you.
I was like, this is a really good point. I don't know. I'm going to have to go in and look this up. So I did a bit of research, because obviously there isn't an obvious, well, I say obviously, not obviously, there isn't a link to chickens. Apparently, it's called chickenpox here in USA and Australia and New Zealand, but in the rest of the world, it's not called chickenpox. They call it by the viral name, which is varicella. So if you're in Europe, like in France, and you said they have chickenpox, they're probably not going to know what you're talking about. And apparently it's to do with when we had smallpox 100 plus years ago. Smallpox was a really nasty infection that often killed children. And so they wanted to differentiate between smallpox and chickenpox, and actually people panicked when they saw the spots and thought that it might be smallpox. So it got nicknamed chickenpox because when you're a chicken, you're not really that serious. So they think it might be that this is the joke brother of smallpox, which we have now eradicated. So that doesn't exist anymore.
Wow. Well, you heard it here first, folks. You now know why it's called chickenpox. So thank you for asking my silly question, but I'm sure there's other people there. And I think now if you go to a pub quiz and you get asked about chickenpox, you can put your hand up and be first there with the answer. The reason that we were really keen to cover chickenpox on the Family Health podcast was because it is one of the most contagious children's illnesses that nearly every parent or carer is going to have to deal with at some point. So let's talk about it then. Let's find out a little bit more about it. Is there a particular age then that your child is more likely to have chickenpox then, Lily? What happens?
So it's not a specific age as such, but the majority of people will catch chickenpox before they're 7. But you can catch it from being, a newborn baby all the way up to actually being an elderly person. There's no point in your life that you're most likely to catch it, but because there's a lot of it around when you're children and you do a lot of touching each other, playing with, the same things, it's more likely to spread amongst young children. So that's typically when we see it, is those kind of preschool, early school years.
And it's contagious, right? So it spreads really easily. Is that right?
It's very contagious, at certain points. So we'll touch on later, I think, the illness and how it develops and progresses. But when it's at its maximal point, it's super contagious. Yeah.
Right. So there is also, and I don't know, you can tell me now whether it's an urban myth, but I've also heard people say if you don't have it as a child, you will get it worse as an adult. Is that actually fact, or is that just one of those urban myths that we've heard in the world of health?
So no, that is true. The evidence suggests that if you have it after the age of 14, you are more likely to have a more serious illness. It doesn't tend to be like life-threatening, but you are more likely to feel very unwell if you have it as an adult for the first time. For sure. Right, whereas if you have it between the ages of around 1 and 5 or 6, that's probably when it's going to be at its mildest. Very young babies also can have a more serious illness and are more at risk of some of the more serious side effects. So if you have it when you're very young or old, it's going to be worse than if you have it in the kind of typical time.
Okay, and it seems that it's most common to catch chickenpox in the late winter or early spring. So why is that? Why are we hearing more cases or knowing that it's more prevalent at those times of year? Or is that complete myth again?
It's not myth. We see more cases of it then, but I think like we spoke about a little bit on the respiratory viruses podcast episode, the evidence is actually that there is probably chickenpox or the virus that causes chickenpox is varicella. So the varicella is around all year round. But in the winter and the spring, it's more likely to get into the body and cause actual symptoms because our immunity is slightly less. The evidence is that if our nose and mouth is cold, then it's more likely to get into our body. And also we are inside a lot more with the windows closed, less ventilation, and we're all mixing in this kind of germ-ridden environment of nursery, school, etc. inside. So it's just much more likely to spread in those colder months. In countries where it's hot all the time and it doesn't change very much for people how much they're inside or outside, it's more of a constant year-round thing. So it's the countries where it's colder at winter and warmer in the summer that you see this difference.
That you see this variation. Okay, well, let's talk then about the symptoms of chickenpox, because we might think we know them, we might not know them all. So what are the symptoms then for us, Lily, of chickenpox?
So I think, everyone thinks spots, quite rightly.
Yeah.
Chickenpox is pox, it's spots. But you don't tend to get symptoms until at least 10 days after you've actually been exposed to it.
10 days.
So it's quite a long incubation period, and that can be up to 3 weeks. So you can see someone 3 weeks ago and then your children get it then. So symptoms appear around 10 to 21 days after you catch it. And the first symptoms you'll get is usually a fever. So a temperature of above 38 tends to be a mild fever, so like 38 to 39, but some children will get a higher fever up to kind of 40, 40.5. And that fever can last for a couple of days before you actually start to see what you think of, which is the rash. Older children may complain of feeling achy, having a bit of a headache, a bit of a sore throat. You kind of feel a bit fluey in essence, that kind of generalized under the weather feeling, and most people will be less hungry or lose their appetite. So in younger children who can't tell you that they're feeling achy, they may just go off their food a little bit and have a bit of a temperature, and then you get the rash. And the rash has 3 very distinct stages of it. So it starts often on the face, but not always, often with just 1 or 2 spots. And as a parent, you probably think, is that just a viral rash, or is that going to be something? And they're usually small, flat or slightly raised, and just pink. They don't look very impressive to begin with. And if you have dark skin, if you have black skin or dark skin, that it's much more difficult to see those first bits, obviously, because they're quite faint. And then that may last a couple of days, but then it will start to spread, and it spreads quite quickly from 1 or 2 spots, often to a lot. Some children may not actually have hundreds of spots, and that's very variable. So some will only end up having 10 or 15 spots, and some will have hundreds of spots. But the spots then become like these fluid-filled little blisters almost, or we call them vesicles, but little fluid, clear-filled spots, and then they burst and scab over. And it's when they are this fluid-filled spot that they become very itchy and very contagious, because that fluid is filled with varicella virus. So it's like a viral solution that your body is excreting. So often what happens is they get itchy at that point, your children scratch them and they burst because the tops come off and all that virus just leaks out everywhere, and that's the super contagious phase. Once they've scabbed over and they're actually look like just a scab, they're not contagious anymore. And so once you've kind of, all of them have scabbed, that's at the point where they're not contagious.
So if they haven't been scratched, they still go to a scab. Is that right? You don't have to.
They will basically pop themselves eventually. But often children speed up that process by scratching them.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about itching in a minute. So you talked about the rash being sometimes harder to see on black and brown skin. So for a parent whose child has got black or brown skin, it might be that they see it when there's more of them and they start to raise into bumps. Is that right?
The bumps, So usually it's the bumps, and the fluid-filled blisters are still obvious on darker skin. And obviously once the first one pops, that will become a crusty scab. But what happens is, in the middle of the illness, you get spots of all the different stages. So you'll get some that are still coming up that are still these kind of flat things. You'll get some that are the fluid filled, and then you'll get some that have scabbed. And that's when it's really obvious to anyone, that this is chickenpox, because you can just see the whole spectrum of spots.
So one of the things that I absolutely hated with my children was watching them just being consumed with itchiness. It was awful, really stressful. It's horrid for them. What can you do to stop this dreaded itching? Is there something that you can do to relieve it?
Yeah, I think the itching is really awful. And it's one thing that I often say to parents some parents say to me, chickenpox is really mild. In fact, people still have chickenpox, parties. I mean, when I was younger, chickenpox parties were a thing. It was like, bring your child and someone's got chickenpox, and then we'll all have chickenpox, and then they'll all have immunity. And actually, I think people underestimate chickenpox. Yes, it's not, for most children, it will be a non-life-threatening illness, but it's not nice. And it causes a fever, it makes you super itchy. And so if you can prevent your children getting chickenpox, just a plug here to say, please don't spread it around. It's not kind and it's not fair.
No.
And in terms of things you can do, you can't get rid of the itching entirely. Stopping using any perfumed soaps or bubble baths or moisturizers on the skin, so you basically want to leave the skin alone as much as possible. Cool baths rather than warm baths, so a cooler bath or a shower rather than a hot bath. The evidence for calamine lotion is limited, but some parents still say to me that it's really helpful.
Okay.
I think that the trials have shown that actually against any other non-scented moisturiser, it's much of a muchness. But if you find it helpful, then it's helpful. And sometimes for your children, there definitely is a thing where when you put something on things, it feels better, doesn't it? Like kids, if you put a plaster on something, sometimes it just magically feels a bit better. So by putting a bit of something on there, it may feel better. And then antihistamines can help with the itch. So typically antihistamine medication is for allergic reaction, but the itchiness is coming from histamine released. So a dose of infant Piriton, especially at night time, because I often think that the itchiness stops them sleeping, and Piriton, a side effect is it makes you a bit drowsy, which probably isn't the worst thing, and it stops the itching. So a dose of antihistamine at night time before bed may be helpful for that.
Okay. And you sometimes hear things like oats in bags, in baths and things like that. Is that proven, or is that just that it's one of those cases where it's not? Okay.
It's one of those things that some people find things that they think are helpful. If there's one area that's particularly bad, cold is quite helpful. So like an ice pack or a cold pack on if there's a couple of spots that are particularly driving them crazy. The other thing is long clothes, so that small hands can't actually get to them, because the more they scratch, the more itchy. You find that with bites, right? The more you scratch them, the more you can't leave them alone. So actually, if you can put long sleeves and long trousers on your child so that they can't get to them, then it may improve it. But often they're on the face and the neck, so it's quite you can't cover that.
And you sometimes, I guess, people potentially can be concerned about scarring, right? So if you scratch a lot, if you've scratched them, does that make you more at risk or subject to scarring then from your chickenpox?
Yes. So if you let the scab heal completely naturally and never touched it, it would be very unlikely to scar. The more you scratch the scab and take the scab off, the longer it will take to heal. And that slow healing is what causes scarring. So instead of the skin being able to heal how it wants to heal, you're constantly interrupting that healing process by taking the scab off, and it's having to do it a different way. So that can lead to scarring. It's why often scars are on the face. So like if you've got one spot here, really accessible. I've still got a chickenpox scar up here.
Yeah, I've got one too on an eyebrow.
On my forehead, which I obviously, when I was a child, that was where I could get to that. And the other time that it might scar is if they get secondary infection. So these little scabs, they are susceptible to them bugs getting into them, and some spots can get infected. And so if you get secondary bacterial infection, those will take longer to heal, and then you can get some scarring.
Okay, so let's just go back to the fact that we've got a child that has the spots have arrived. Are we supposed to go to the doctors with chickenpox? Because you've just said just how contagious it is. So do you really want people with chickenpox walking into GP surgeries? What's the advice for parents and carers listening, thinking, I've spotted chickenpox, what do I do now?
No, ideally we don't want children with chickenpox in healthcare settings unless they have to be there. So if your child has typical chickenpox, you're coping at home, they might have a little bit of a temperature, but that's settling with Calpol or Nurofen, and you're managing to get in enough fluids, but there's a rash, then ideally we wouldn't want you to then bring them somewhere where they could spread that to lots of other children. If you need advice, you can either call your GP and see if you can do a telephone consultation, or speak to 111 if it's out of hours. They may be able to give you some advice. There's also some advice on the NHS website, or other more local health related websites have advice around chickenpox. But there are times that actually you may need to go and see someone when chickenpox is more severe, or you're worried about some of the more severe signs of chickenpox. And obviously we're not going to say that you shouldn't get support if your child is very unwell with it.
Yeah, okay. What just quickly now then, with regard to these sort of more severe, if someone's listening going, okay, well what's more severe then? What sort of symptoms might you see if it was more severe?
So I think that if it's just chickenpox, if it's just the effects of chickenpox, the severe things would possibly be lack of eating and drinking. So most children won't eat very much when they get sick. We're not too worried about eating if you're weaned. So if you're over 6 months, we don't worry too much about food, but we do worry about hydration. So your children need to be drinking, and they need to be getting in enough fluid to stay hydrated. For babies who are on milk, we tend to say that's at least 50% of their normal feeds. And for children who are drinking, it's enough fluid that they are alert and are weeing at least 2 to 3 times in a 24-hour period as a minimum. So if your child won't drink anything, because sometimes you can get chickenpox all around the mouth, they can even be inside the mouth. So if they're not drinking anything at home, or they're not weeing, then that you will have to escalate that and see someone about that. Equally, if they've had 5 days of fever over 38 and the fever is not improving, or if they've got signs of a secondary infection, and by that I mean, as I said before, this is a viral thing. The spots erupt and then they're open, and what can happen is you can get bacteria that normally live on our skin or in the ether can get into those spots and actually cause a bacterial infection. And what will happen is the spots will become more red, the redness will spread, and then you'll start to get pus coming out of these spots. So it's typical for them to burst for a little bit of weeping, bit of crusting, but what's not normal is like a huge amount of redness or pus coming out. And if that's the case, then you're probably going to need to have some antibiotics to treat that. And so you would need to see your GP or another health professional at that point.
You talked about briefly about paracetamol and giving paracetamol just for I guess for reducing the fever and for pain relief. I've heard, or parents have said that they've heard that there is a difference between giving paracetamol and ibuprofen to children with chickenpox. Is that a thing? Is there a recommendation on what you should or shouldn't give to children with chickenpox?
Yeah, so it's not an absolute never to give ibuprofen. So the thing that they say is you shouldn't give ibuprofen, so Nurofen, to children with chickenpox. It's quite difficult because often, as I said, the fever starts first and you don't see the spots for a couple of days. And so often children will have been given Nurofen in those first couple of days for a temperature because you don't really know what illness this is. But there is some evidence that suggests that ibuprofen leads to a higher risk of nasty skin infections with chickenpox. One in particular called necrotizing fasciitis, which is actually as nasty as it sounds, but it's also extremely rare. Never seen it. But there was a study that showed that there is a slight increase in necrotizing fasciitis in children who are given ibuprofen. So we tend to say that you obviously can't avoid in those first few days before you know it's chickenpox giving something for a temperature. If you've given it, that's fine. But once you're in the full rashy stage, if you know that this is chickenpox, try and stick to paracetamol or Calpol, and don't give Nurofen or ibuprofen until they've all scabbed over and healed. Now, in hospitals, sometimes we do give ibuprofen, but obviously they're in a very controlled environment where we're monitoring them very closely and we know what to look out for. So that is the generic advice, is stick to Calpol or paracetamol if you can.
Right, okay. And let's talk then about being off school, because we've talked about this, we talked about this with our respiratory viruses podcast about when you keep children home. I think people know more about, that you should keep your kids at home at some point when they have chickenpox, but at what point? When can you send them back? When should you keep them off from? What if your child is generally okay with the chickenpox, so they might have a few spots, but perhaps they've had a lighter coverage than some children that have been absolutely covered? What's the advice on keeping them away and infection control?
So you should keep them off from the first spot appearing.
Right.
So the point at which you know this is chickenpox, they should stay home. Or if your other child has chickenpox and then, second child spikes a temperature, I would arguably say that that's probably going to be chickenpox. So they should stay home then, before the first spot. And you have to keep them home until the last spot has scabbed. So they all have to have scabbed over. Now, they may still look a complete mess and be covered in scabs, but they're not contagious once the last spot has scabbed. Okay. Once they've gone past that weepy, clear fluid stage.
And that's quite an important message, because I guess if you're a parent and another child who doesn't belong to you returns to your nursery or your school and they're absolutely covered, there is this moment where you think, oh gosh, oh no, should they be back? But if they're scabbed,
but they're not contagious at that point.
They're not contagious. Yeah. Okay.
No.
Okay.
So that might be another week or so before they actually even start to look better. Those scabs do take a while to heal. But it's the clear fluid filled stage where they're really contagious.
Really contagious. Okay. And when you think about infection control and you think about hand washing and those sorts of things, is there a way amongst your household of preventing chickenpox going, all the way through your children? Or is it just a fait accompli that's going to happen if you've got multiple children?
It's very contagious. So it's very difficult because you're dealing with things that you cannot see, that are microscopic, that get everywhere. Right. Hand washing is super helpful. Trying to separate toys. So, for instance, keep a few toys for one of the children who has got chickenpox and try and separate the toys for those that don't. But it is hard. Making sure you're washing bedding of that child on a hot wash, so more, like 90 rather than 40 to kill the virus. Because if you did it on a cold wash and then put it on your other child's bed or whatever, it's just going to be living there. And trying to cover the rash as much as possible with clothing that, again, you wash on a hot wash. So long sleeves, long trousers, if they've got, hopefully, minimum spots that are exposed, that's better.
Okay. Now, I have had multiple parents say to me that in their family they've had chickenpox twice, and yet they were told that they couldn't get it twice. So what's the truth? Can you get chickenpox twice? Is that a thing?
Yes, you can get chickenpox.
You can. You can. You heard it here. You heard it here. You can.
You can. It's not typical. So most people will only get chickenpox once. The majority. But it's not impossible to get chickenpox twice. And it's more common to get chickenpox twice if you have chickenpox when you are less than 6 months old for the first time. If you have a very, very mild illness the first time. So if you only have 1 or 2 spots the first time, you're more likely to get it again. Or if you have a compromised immune system, so you're on treatment for, you're on steroid medication or chemotherapy or something like that, which is suppressing your immune system, and you get it, then you can get it again. And all those things are because it relies on your immune system recognizing that it's chickenpox and making antibodies against the varicella virus. And therefore, if you don't make lots of antibodies against it, the next time you get it, your body may not remember fully that it's had it, and so you may get the illness again. So you
can get it twice. It is possible, and in fact, the cases that the parents who've spoken to me about have talked about their children having it when they were young babies, which we're going to talk about in a moment. But I just want to talk to you first about this rash and being confused, because quite often parents or carers will say, look, I'm not a doctor, so I don't know what I'm seeing. Is this a chickenpox rat? That might be why they feel the need to go and have a GP appointment, because they almost need a medical professional to confirm it. What does chickenpox sometimes get confused with? So what other things could potentially it be mistaken with or for?
I think the hard part is often before you get the blistering and the scabs. So when it's just like red or pink raised dots, that's a very generic appearance for a lot of different childhood rashes, and in particular viral exanthem, which is basically what we call a viral rash. So any virus can cause a rash, looks quite similar to that. So it's quite difficult in that kind of day 2 or 3 when they've just got the red spot, like spots that haven't yet become blisters or scabs. So it can get confused with that. It can get confused with hand, foot and mouth. So hand, foot and mouth, you also get red spots, but they don't then become fluid filled or burst. And typically hand, foot and mouth happens on the hands, feet and mouth. But it also, actually, what it doesn't say on the tin is it happens all over the body and on the bottom as well. So hand, foot and mouth can start anywhere. But the spots of hand, foot and mouth won't become fluid filled and burst. They will become red raised bumps. Sometimes you get skin peeling, but it's typically in the distribution of palms of hands, soles of feet, around the bottom area and around the mouth. And then the last one that it sometimes gets confused with is impetigo, which is actually a bacterial skin infection. And that tends to happen on the mouth or around the face. Starts with like a small scab, and then you get a lot of scabby, blistering kind of lesions on the face or mouth. And because chickenpox typically also starts on the mouth and looks like scabs, sometimes if it's just 1 or 2 spots on the face, parents are not entirely sure if this is chickenpox or if this is impetigo. And I think if it's really not obvious, it's fair to take some pictures and see if you can send those to a doctor. So most GP practices now will have some kind of online consultation thing or email where you can send pictures in. If it's just the florid, red, slightly raised spots, but none of them have become fluid filled or blistered yet, then it may be worth, as long as your child is otherwise okay, just waiting. And just keep them at home, wait, because actually if it's chickenpox, within 24 to 48 hours, it will be clear, because you'll get those 3 types of spots. Everywhere.
Okay, so sharing a picture with your GP is a good way. And I know that, as you said, a lot of the surgeries have these parent portals where you go, or patient portals where you can send pictures and have that consultation. I remember I've been pregnant a lot of times, as our listeners will know. I've got 6 children. So I remember being nervous about chickenpox in pregnancy. And, if you hear that another friend's child has chickenpox and you're pregnant, that you need to stay away. What's the advice for pregnant women when it comes to chickenpox and being in the vicinity of people that have got the chickenpox virus?
So the reason we worry about chickenpox in pregnancy is because the varicella virus can basically infect your unborn baby, and it can cause quite serious congenital abnormalities or illness at the point of birth of that baby. But this is almost entirely in mothers who are not immune to chickenpox. So in mothers who have not ever had chickenpox. So if you have never had chickenpox and then you get pregnant, you do need to be moderately careful if you hear someone has chickenpox then you should stay away. And actually, if you know that you have never had chickenpox and you get pregnant, it may be worth mentioning that relatively early on to your midwife, so that it's in your notes that you're not immune to chickenpox.
Okay.
And often I'm not a midwife and I don't know the answer to this, but I feel like they may ask you that anyway, or screen for that at some point, because if you then get chickenpox and you've never had it before, they will actually try and treat you to prevent your unborn baby becoming unwell. If you have had chickenpox, you're much less likely to get it again, as we said, but it's not impossible. So some people may get it again. And so you should still be careful, as in avoid children who have chickenpox. But equally, if you're a mum and your toddler gets chickenpox and you're pregnant, you can't avoid them. So I think if it's in your house and you're pregnant, run it past your midwife or your GP. Just call them and say, look, I'm pregnant, I'm 16 weeks pregnant and my 2-year-old has chickenpox. And they will run you through what you need to do or what you don't need to do, because in essence you're not going to be able to prevent yourself being exposed to it, but you probably won't catch it.
Great. Okay. That's really helpful. But I also wanted to ask you about shingles, because I don't know a lot about shingles, and maybe our listeners don't either. So I thought while I've got you, I'd ask you. Shingles, I understand, is less likely to affect children, but this podcast covers all of the family. So if somebody is listening and interested to know a little bit about shingles, it is connected with chickenpox. Is that right? Yeah.
So this causes a whole heap of confusion, and totally understandably, because it is quite confusing. Varicella, the virus that causes chickenpox, also causes shingles. It's exactly the same virus. But what happens is the first time you get varicella, you get chickenpox. And then once you've had chickenpox, that varicella virus actually lives dormant in your nerve cells for the rest of your life, which sounds awful, but most of us will never know that we have a few dormant viruses living in our nerve cells. For most people, it will never reactivate. It will just lie there and cause us no problems. But occasionally, for some people, that virus will, at some point in their life, reactivate. And we think that's probably when your immune system is knocked by something else. So you get another infection or another illness, or you're really tired and run down, and that virus takes its opportunity to come back, and it reactivates and causes symptoms. And the symptoms are similar but not exactly the same as chickenpox, in that it only affects the skin and the soft tissues that specific nerve supplies. So for instance, if it's living in a nerve that supplies your face, you'll get a rash and pain on that one part of your face, but you won't get it anywhere else. It won't spread all over your body. It will literally be like a stripe along your face. And it can be anywhere in your body. So some people get a stripe on their leg, on their arm, on their chest, but you get the same rash that you would get with chickenpox. So those fluid-filled blisters that scab over, and it's often very painful. It's often much more painful than chickenpox. So the nerve itself becomes really irritated, and you get this neuropathic pain that's like pins and needles, people stabbing you, but just in a very small area of your body. And that is shingles. And actually you can't catch shingles, but you can catch varicella. So when you've got those fluid-filled blisters, say it's on a stripe on your arm, those fluid-filled blisters are filled with the varicella virus, and you are contagious in the same way you would be if you had chickenpox. So you can spread that to someone else. Now, if they've never had varicella and you give them that, they will catch chickenpox, not shingles. Yeah. So you can't give someone shingles, but you can give someone varicella, which can then go on to cause chickenpox. But you won't spread shingles. So that person will have to catch chickenpox, and then they would have to let it go dormant, and then it would have to reactivate.
Okay. How do you treat shingles then? Yeah, it does. It does sound it, but that really cleared that up. So how do you treat shingles then? So if you've got this patch on your body that's presenting, with those
Like
symptoms
that.
of lots of pain and blisters and what have you, how do you treat that?
So if we catch it early, we can give antiviral medication actually. So we don't tend to give antiviral medication for chickenpox, but if it's shingles, we do give antiviral medication. But you have to catch it in the first kind of couple of days of the illness for it to be effective. So if you come to the GP five days down the line, they'll say, look, it's not actually worth it because it's probably almost run its course anyway. So it's one of the few times that if you think you've got shingles, it may be worth escalating that to a doctor earlier. Yeah. Whereas chickenpox we don't want to know. And often with shingles, you get the pain before you get the rash. So you'll think, like people often say like, oh, I've just had this really painful, weird part of my arm for like 3 days and I don't understand why. And then all of a sudden they get spots and it's obvious. So we can give antiviral medication, and then similar to chickenpox basically. So things for if it's itchy, taking antihistamines, cold things, cool water on it, to wash it. And the helpful thing about shingles is that it's often more easy to cover because it's just one bit.
Patch.
So with adults, we say, actually, you don't need to stay home and isolate as long as you've covered it, because if it's like on your arm or leg, you're not going to spread it to someone else. If it's on your face, it's much more difficult. You may need to isolate until you get that scabbing again.
Yeah. This is fascinating, and thank you, because that's really cleared it up in my mind, because I think there's so much for us and then in the world of health, and I'm sure it's one of the reasons that we have the Family Health podcast is that people hear things or things that are not quite truths about illnesses, and what you've given us there in information about chickenpox and then when we went on to talk about shingles is really, really helpful. So let's just go back then to chickenpox for your takeaway for everybody. So if anybody's fast forwarded through any part of the pod or they've just picked up this piece at the end and gone, what's the main thing that you would like people to take away from your advice today on chickenpox? What would your advice be, Lillie?
So I think the knowledge that most children will get chickenpox at some point in their life until we start vaccinating children against it, which other countries do. So like the USA and Australia, they vaccinate children against chickenpox, and they don't see chickenpox like we do here. There's been quite a lot of rumours about the chickenpox vaccine being incorporated into our routine immunisations here. I think it's quite likely that it's going to happen at some point in the next few years, but I can't tell you at what point that's going to happen. But it may be that someone's listening to this podcast in 5 years' time and chickenpox doesn't happen like this anymore. I mean, that would be amazing, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
But until we do that, the reality is that children are going to get chickenpox, and for most children, 90% of children, it's going to be a relatively mild illness that self-limits, that you don't need to do very much for, and they're going to get better. I think knowing what the rash looks like, knowing those 3 stages of rash, and knowing when to isolate your child, keep your child away from other children to protect them and vulnerable people, because as we said, if you're pregnant and you've never had chickenpox, or if you're elderly and you've never had it, or you're on chemotherapy or something, chickenpox can actually be quite nasty. So although that for most children it's not a big deal, I think it's still ethically very important that we protect vulnerable people from chickenpox, so at what point to keep your children home when they have the spots.
Lillie, it's been really helpful, and I've learnt absolutely loads, having been on the journey and the joys of chickenpox. And I hope that everybody who's listening today has found this brilliant advice really helpful and will share it with family and friends. So we really appreciate your time today. Folks, as always, please do make sure that you subscribe to both the Mini First Aid socials and the Family Health podcast channels, because it will provide you with newsletters and up-to-date family health advice. If you want to watch this episode and you want to see what Dr. Lillie looks like in real life, you can view the podcast on our Family Health Family Family Health Podcast YouTube channel, and you can also subscribe across your podcast platforms. And my final request today, before I go, is that if you have any other family health topics that you would like us to invite a brilliant expert like Dr. Lillie to come and talk to us about, please do get in touch, because you help us guide our programme. And we know that so many parents and carers have got in touch with us going, I need to know more about chickenpox. I need to know how to spot it, how to treat it. So Dr. Lillie, thank you for joining us today. You've been listening to the Family Health Podcast. Thank you for listening to Family Health by Mini First Aid. I hope you found our podcast really useful and informative. If you want to know more about Mini First Aid classes, courses, qualification courses or first aid supplies, please do visit minifirstaid.co.uk or look us up on all your favourite social platforms at Mini First Aid. And just a little reminder from me and our sponsor, Things Happen, that if reviewing your life insurance is still on your to-do list, take time to get in touch with a Things Happen advisor today.